Hello student, welcome to massive open online course on Indian economy. Present module deals with the rapid growth of population in India. After completing this module, you are able to understand the distinctive features of development of population in India. You are also able to know the growth of population in our country. The present module also help you to know the causes of rapid growth of population as well as the causes of decline in death rate in our country. The module consists with 7 sections. Section 1 introduces the theme, whereas Section 2 deals with the distinctive features of development of population in India, and Section 3 presents the trend of population in our country as well as the growth of population in our country, and Section 4 presents the death rate as well as birth rate in our country, whereas Section 5 explains the causes of high birth rate in India, and Section 6 explains the causes of decline in death rate in our country, and finally Section 7 makes concluding remarks. Population is a very important ingredient in every country as well as in the development process of the country. On the other hand, this population becomes a burden if the country fails to manage the high growth rate of population in her development process. In India, decade after decade, population of India increased at a very high rate, and now we are passing in the phase of population explosion. During the last decades, the population in our country increased at a very significant rate, and now we become the second most populous country in the world after China. But in our country, the percentage share of total population compared to the global population is around 15%, whereas the share of total geographic area is only 2.4% and the share of total income of the world is only 2%. And 1/4 of the Asia's total population lives in this country. Side by side, it is also true that during the period 1961 to 2021, the population in our country increased around 212%. During the same time, the population in whole of the world increased around 160%. It is argued that such a large population puts pressure on its limited resources and is also responsible for many socio-economic problems in our country like unemployment, underemployment, poverty, malnutrition, etc. In this brief background, present module deals with the empirical evidence of the growth of population in our country as well as explains the causes of high growth rate in India. Section 2, the distinctive features of the development of population in our country. During the last decades, the growth of population in India is significantly high compared to other countries, and if India is not able to maintain this high growth rate, then within a decades, India will become the most populous country in the world. And side by side, it is also true that the life expectancy in India is relatively low. It is around 68 years, which is comparatively low compared to the life expectancy of some developed countries like USA, where the life expectancy is 79 years. In case of Australia, life expectancy is 83 years. Side by side, the high growth rate of population in our country or high birth rate in our country creates the huge population in India. And in the early 1970s, each woman gave birth to an average of 5 children, and it is gradually decreasing, and now there are more than 2 children per woman, whereas this figure in case of USA is only 1.64. India has also experienced very high birth rate, low death rate side by side. The maternal mortality rate and child mortality rate also significantly declined in our country. And 1/3 of the India's population is now under the 15 years old, and the average age of Indians is 26 years. Section 3 deals with the population growth in India. This diagram shows the trend of population for a very long period starting from 1901 to 2011. This information is based on the data provided by Census of India in our country. In the year 1901, the number of population in our country was 23.8 crore, which increased to 36.1 crore in 1951. That is, during this 50 years period, the number of population only increased from 23.8 crores to 36.1 crores. But after that, after 1951, population of India increased at a very high rate, and number of population in 2001 was 102.9 crore. That is, in the next 50 years, starting from 1951 to 2001, number of population in our country increased from 36.1 to 102.9. That is, more than 3 times of population increased during this 50 years period. In the latest census year 2011, number of population in our country was 121.1 crore. This is the decadal growth rate of population in India for the same period, 1901 to 2011. During the early decades of 20th century, the population growth was relatively low. Specifically, in the decade 1901 to 1911, the growth rate of population, the decadal growth rate of population was only 5.8%, and this growth rate became negative in the next decade, 1911 to 1921, where the growth rate was minus 0.3. After 1921, India has experienced relatively high growth rate of population, and growth rate of population increased to 11% in the decade 1921 to 31, and it became 30.3% in the decade 1941 to 51. But after 51, the growth rate of population significantly increased in our country, and in the decade 1951 to 61, it reached to 21.5%. And after that, in the next decade, 1961 to 1971, the growth rate of population in our country was highest, which is 24.8%. It was 24.7% in the decade 1971-81, and after that, this growth rate of population marginally declined, and in the latest census decade 2001 to 2011, the growth rate of population was 17.7%. On the basis of the nature of the growth of the population during this period, starting from 1901 to 2011, we have classified 3 phases in respect of the nature of growth of population. The first phase is treated as the low population growth, then fast growth of population, and third phase is the population explosion. The period of 1901 to 1921 is treated as the low growth of population, whereas the period after 1921 up to 1951 is treated as the high growth rate of population, whereas the periods after 1951 is treated as the population explosion. This can be understood if we look into the increase of the population by absolute number or its growth rate. In the year 1901, the population of India was 23.84, which increased at the extent of 137 lakh and became 25.21 crore. But after that, after 1911, in the year 1921, the number of population decreased by 7.7 lakh. And during this decade, 1911 to 1921, Indian economy has experienced the famines, plague, malaria, and other diseases, and because of this, the number of population decreased at the extent of 7.7 lakh. And it is noted that the influenza in 1980 it caused 140 lakh deaths in our country. Therefore, this particular period 1901 to 1921 is treated as the low population growth. But after 1921, the population growth tremendously increased in our country. Therefore, this particular year 1921 is treated as the year of divide. And here the population increased by 277 lakh in the year 1931, and the growth rate is 1.1. During these 3 decades, 1931, 1941 and 1951, the growth rate of population is positive but less than 1%. Therefore, this period is treated as the fast growth of the population. But after 1951, the growth rate of population increased to more than 2%. In the year 1961, it is 2.2%. 1971, 1981, in this decade, the growth rate of population was 2.5%, and during the entire period, the growth rate of population was more than 2%. Therefore, this incidence of high growth rate of population in our country is treated as the population explosion. Section 3, here we discuss the high birth rate and the low death rate, the empirical evidence of high birth rate and low death rate. This figure help us to understand the trend of high birth rate and low death rate in our country. In the year 1961, the birth rate was 41.7, which decreased to 35.9 in the year 1981 and 25.9 in 2011. During the latest year 2020, the birth rate decreased to 16.6, whereas the death rate was relatively low compared to the birth rate. In the year 1961, the mortality rate or death rate in India was 21.7%, which decreased to 13% in the year 1981 and 8.6% in the year 2001 and 7.4% in the year 2020. Not only that, if we analyze the difference between birth rate and death rate, then this picture helps us to understand the trend of the difference between birth rate and death rate. The birth rate is usually higher than the death rate in our country. Therefore, this difference is positive. And in the year 1961, the difference of birth rate and death rate was 20 percentage points, which increased to 23 percentage point in 1981. But after 1981, the difference between birth rate and death rate gradually decreasing in India, and in the year 2020, it has become to 9 percentage points. We can also analyze the birth rate and death rate on the basis of the ratio of the birth rate to the death rate. The ratio of the birth rate to the death rate in our country is averaging as 2. That means birth rate is 2 times higher than the death rate. This particular figure help us to understand the trend of the ratio of the birth rate to the death rate, which increased to 1.9 in the year 1961 to 3.1 in the year 1999. After that, this rate marginally declined, and in the year 2020, it has become to 2.2. That is, we have experienced a very high birth rate and relatively low death rate in our country. Now, the next 2 sections help us to understand the causes of this high birth rate and low death rate in our country. Section 5. Section 5 deals with the causes of the high birth rate in our country, there are different socio-economic factors caused for the high birth rate in India. And we can explain the socio-economic factor one after another. First one is the lack of education and awareness. Education is a very important factor in our society, in the development process of a country. But in our country, more than 1/4 of the male people are illiterate, and more than 1/3 of the female people are illiterate. Not only that, the number of percentage share of people having the education level below primary is around 50%. This information indicate that the education level in our country is relatively poor. As a result, people in our country not able to manage their marriage life, family planning, child bearing, and as a result, we have experienced high birth rate in our country. Another reason for the high birth rate in India is the religious superstition and social norms. A major section of the people in our country also follow the religious superstition and the social norms. And this religious superstition and social norms also varies from one religion to another religion. As a result, the birth rate also varies from one religion to another religion. According to the estimation of the census of India, the birth rate of the Muslim population in our country is very high compared to the birth rate of the Hindu population. During the period 1991 to 2001, during this decade, the Muslim growth rate was 29.5%, whereas the growth rate of Hindu population was only 19.9%. That is, growth rate of Muslim population is 10% higher than that of the Hindu population. But after 2001, the growth rate of Muslim population significantly decreased in our country. Along with, we have also experienced the reduction of the growth rate of population of other religions. The low age marriage is also caused for the high birth rate in our country. In our country, a large section of the women is relatively, marriage of large section of women is relatively low, and their time of the marriage, their age is less than 18 years. A study conducted by an organization, International Center for Research on Women, they have showed that the girls married before 18 years of age are twice as likely to be beaten, slapped or threatened by their husbands, and 3 times more likely to experience sexual violences. That is, this early age marriage is the consequence, and they have experienced domestic violence. Not only that, in another study conducted by International Institute for Population Science and Macro International in the year 2005 and 2006, they showed that due to early age marriage, they have experienced high fertility rate, and they are not able to control the fertility. Therefore, they have experienced a larger number of childbirth. Poverty is also an important cause for the high birth rate. In our country, a significant portion of the people are living below the poverty line. Therefore, they are expecting that to increase the income, they are depend on the more children, and as a result, they are expecting larger size of the families, and as a result, the birth rate in our country is relatively large. Side by side, lack of reproductive health services is also an important reason for the high birth rate in our country. The reproductive health services are not reached in the rural region as well as in the backward region. Therefore, the women living in the rural and as well as backward region are not able to use effective method of contraceptive to control the birth rate. Another reason which is also important in our country for the high birth rate is the lack of the family planning. Due to low education and awareness as well as lack of the reproductive health services, a major section of the people in our country not able to follow the family planning. As a result, they have experienced a larger number of child. Now we discuss the causes of decline in the death rate in our country. And this decline of overall death rate in our country is due to the decline of the maternal mortality rate, decline of the child mortality rate including infant mortality rate, as well as India has also experienced the reduction of the mortality due to some disease like tuberculosis, malaria, influenza. And side by side, it is also equally important that during the course of the time, the health service also extended for the people, and as a result, Indian economy or in our country, we have experienced relatively low death rate. This figure help us to understand the trend of the decline in maternal mortality rate. This maternal mortality rate is defined as the estimated number of women between the age of 15 to 49 years who die from the pregnancy related causes while pregnant or within 42 days of termination of the pregnancy per 1 lakh live births. And this maternal mortality rate in our country decreased from 370 in the year 2000 to 145 in the year 2017. This huge reduction of the maternal mortality rate is also the good sign for our country, and side by side it also caused for the decline in the death rate, overall death rate in India. Another reason for decline of the death rate in our country is the decline of the child mortality rate. Here child mortality rate can be calculated in two aspects. One is under 5 mortality rate and another is infant mortality rate. In case of under 5 mortality rate, the age group we consider is 0 to 5 years, whereas in case of infant mortality rate, the age group is relatively lower. In case of under 5 mortality rate, the India also experienced a significant reduction. In the year 2000, the under 5 mortality rate in our country was 92. That is, out of 1000 live births, 92 children below 5 years died in the year 2000. And this under 5 mortality rate significantly decreased from 92 to 33 in the year 2020. This is also good sign for the economy, and some researchers they argued that due to supplementary nutrition benefit by ICDS and vaccination of children, the under 5 mortality rate has declined in our country. This is the mortality rate of newborn baby, which is treated as the neonatal mortality rate, and here the age group is 28 days. This neonatal mortality rate also decreased in our country from 45 to 20 during this period. Not only that, here we have also presented the incidence of decline of tuberculosis. This is the disease that caused for the death of a number of people in our country. But this incidence of tuberculosis also decreased in our country from 289 in the year 2000 to 188 in the year 2020. All these evidences, that is the reduction of maternal mortality rate, child mortality rate, or infant mortality rate, or incidence of tuberculosis, indicate that the mortality rate gradually decreasing in our country. As a result, we have experienced a relatively low mortality rate in our country, and this mortality rate also gradually decreasing in India. Side by side, this factor also important to the reduction of the mortality rate, and these factors can be treated as the control of epidemics, more medical facilities, and the spread of education. During the course of the time, the government health service as well as private health service also able to manage the epidemics like plague, smallpox, and the disease like TB and malaria, and as a result we have experienced a low death rate. But during the COVID-19 pandemic, we have experienced a loss of life at the extent of 5.3 lakh people in our country. During the course of the time, it is also true that the Indians have experienced the better medical facilities. Due to improvement of the medical facilities, the death rate also relatively low in our country. We try to overcome the death rate due to the treatment of some disease. And spread of education, it is true that a portion of our country are illiterate, and side by side it is also true that the number of education gradually increasing in our country. This increase of the education, of spread of the education also effective to reduce the death rate in our country. Now we come to the conclusion. To control this high growth rate of population in our country, Government of India adopted two population policy. One is in the year 1976 and another is in the year 2000. Side by side, Government of India also introduced family planning in 1980s and 1990s. These population policies and family planning have some impact in the urban areas, but on the whole, these population policies and family planning not effective to reduce the population growth in our country. As a result, we have experienced very large number of population in India.